It's very likely that you are aware of things that are going on in the world. And I want to give us some context by sort of painting a picture of some not so distant happenings. And maybe we can get into the implications of those things. So, Kwaku, I'll sort of present these to you. But
Okay.
do you remember a few years ago on January 6th, there was an insurrection at the Capitol?
Actually, I believe that was a tour of the Capitol building that maybe went a little bit awry.
Ah, I see.
Can I present one to you?
Yeah, sure.
There was a lot of negative press around people who were against vaccinations that was happening during COVID. Do you remember this?
Are you talking about the thing that causes autism?
No, the COVID vaccines.
Yeah, like I said, the thing that causes autism.
That's okay. That's interesting. All right.
What about all the kind of conspiracy theories that have been circulating and have become so popular that you might hear these on news stations around the world?
I think that's more about revealing what's happening in the deep state. I'm not sure if people have heard about this, but there's a lot going on within the deep state that we're not aware of.
Well, maybe one final thing. At least we have science that sort of keeps us grounded, correct?
Well, I mean, it's a matter of opinion as far as science is concerned. Have you done your research?
My own research?
The research.
Not quite. Not quite. Okay. These sound like familiar pieces of discourse to you? This is the reality we live in, and as comical as this may have seemed, this is the paradigm which we're in with young people and each other and folks that we love and care about.
And work with.
And work with. And that paints a very scary future for us. And that's probably very likely why you are here. You are concerned about those things. We want to start to investigate that a bit.
Before we go further, I know typically we're supposed to talk for 45 minutes and then allow you guys to ask questions for 15 minutes because we're the experts on everything, and then you get to chime in at the end. But instead of doing that, it'd be really great to hear some thoughts from people in the audience about this. How do you feel about this duality of truth, or the idea of truth being based upon opinion and experience as opposed to facts? Does that? Oh, yes, please.
I think as an educator, it poses some really interesting catch-22s because on the one hand, truth is a matter of perspective and people have a lot of different truths. And so you want kids to understand that reality. But at the same time, we don't want them to take that so far that they don't think that there's anything that they can trust or believe in.
Thoughts on that? It's like the first day of school. I'm not sure if any of you have ever experienced this, where you're in front of a bunch of kids you don't know and no one wants to speak. Oh, thank you, sir.
I think it's terrifying, for one thing, and it's also puzzling. Talking with kids who know a certain truth because they've experienced it or if they've done research on it. Research into ghosts, for example, and they know that ghosts are real because there's one in their house. And there's they're talking about that at their exhibition of learning. So where to go with that? It's a real puzzle in terms of balancing out honoring student learning and honoring student voice and where students are, and then providing a critical lens on the things that all of us are saying.
I love the phrase "critical lens." We're gonna address that.
And also this idea of you can research things and come up to any conclusion you want. We're going to talk about that later because it is an important component of what we think is going on and something we need to sort of work on.
And so to qualify all this, I forgot to mention, we're going to spend 20 minutes on pure doom and gloom. We are frankly going to say this is all the things that scare us and we hope to scare you, but we're not going to stay in that space. But we just wanted to qualify this. We are going to be negative for 20 minutes.
Yeah, and we're setting this up both for you, but also for us, because we could probably doom and gloom.
4 hours? easily.
Yes.
Do you want to get into some of the statistics?
I'd love to. Yeah, so thank you so much for sort of sharing some of those thoughts. I'm sure you have many others. There's a couple different components of this piece that we want to look at, but of course we want to try to anchor it always to what young folks are experiencing today and what, of course, we as educators need to do to be in support of them, helping them navigate this emerging world that, like you said, Rob, is terrifying. What does that mean? So when we're thinking about students, I was sort of called to this work a few years ago when we had somebody who had done a report at Stanford. We didn't introduce ourselves.
At all.
Maybe that's.
At all. We just went right into, we wanted the 20 minutes. Hardcore.
I think it's too late.
I think before you get into the statistics, let's qualify why why you've done your research. Who are you?
I am Louie Montoya. I work at Stanford University at the D School, less intimately known as the Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design. I teach there at the D School, but I've also worked in what is called the K-12 lab, which I've made a concerted effort to sort of bring the idea of human-centered design, those methodologies, out into the K-12 space, whether it be for students or for educators to sort of reimagine the way that they do education.
It's nice to meet you, Louie. My name is Kwaku Aning. I'm currently the director for the Center of Innovation and Entrepreneurial Thinking at the San Diego Jewish Academy, which means my title has every single vowel in it except for Y. Previously to that, I was the head of digital learning for a charter network on the East Coast. And then prior to that, I was a music teacher for 10 years at various charter schools. I also worked as a tech consultant for New York City schools as well. And a lot of my work involves researching and experimenting with emerging tech, which allows me to collaborate with Louie and other people at the D School and finding ways to make connections between what is happening in the world and what our kids should be learning and preparing them for that.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk about the students then.
Please.
So there was a study done in 2013 that asked Stanford students whether they could discern a fake website from a real one. They felt confident that they could. And then they actually had them go through a series of websites, some that they had made up and some that were legit. And they could not do it. Stanford students could not discern fake websites from real websites. This is 2013. Just a couple of years ago, they did. So, okay, because of that, all these sort of methodologies were developed around helping then folks be able to decipher, okay, you need to sort of look at multiple sources, you need to do all these things. There were sort of like steps that then entered into the curriculum that were going to help folks. This was, made aware, and so we did things about it. Just a couple years ago, another report went out where 96% of incoming Stanford students still couldn't do it. And in this case, they sort of set up a situation where they were having students try to evaluate the sort of authenticity or the honesty of one of these websites, and the students could not catch that, say, for instance, a website that was being funded by big oil companies might have a biased take on environmental issues. These are Stanford students. That was a sort of harrowing realization. And one I think that if we're being very honest about, I had to check myself on, is like, would I be able to do that? Do I always do that?
So in the sort of vibe of making sure that we are having a conversation and not just talking at all of you, what are your thoughts on that? Why do you think that is? I have a theory that I was sharing with Louie, but we really wanted to sort of see what other educators in the room thought about that and thought some of the reasons behind that were. Yes, sir.
I have my thought about the whole thing is when I was young, and I would tell students this, we were younger, and somebody said, "When is David Lee Roth's birthday?" it's not there. You have to go find it. And you might go everywhere, as long as you don't go into a library or a source, I think it was called Eric back then, then you really wouldn't know. But as you would talk to people like, do you know when it is? No. And then finally you see a dude, Van Halen shirt on, Van Halen everything, like, or when was David Lee Roth? He was born this date, he was born here. Then you would get excited, like you learned something. Instead, right now, it's just so fast, instant. Oh, it's this. Did you check that? Like, and we don't teach critical theory almost anywhere. I didn't hear epistemology until I was almost finished with my doctorate. It was my last class. And I was like, do you mean, like, I have to question everything? And that was mind-numbing. Like, that was 8 years ago.
Wow.
Hi, I actually had a very different take on this. I don't want to blame the education system and the educators' own attempt for the lack of skills of how to differentiate a fake website, because honestly, a lot of companies put a lot of money into making sure that people cannot differentiate that. Volkswagen, for example, they hire a research center who hire research centers so that finally there comes out a paper saying that they're environmentally friendly, and nobody knew about that, even the government, for many, many years. So I would say educators, of course, we have to do a better job. And sorry for Stanford that your student cannot do it very well, but it's not your fault. It's a bigger problem than that. We should address alongside with blaming the educators and blaming the students. And sorry to say, but I really don't feel fair if, Stanford student or student from Ivy League are considered to be the standard of like brilliant students, because maybe it's come from background, but it's a little bit hurtful when people think that people from Ivy League school supposed to be geniuses who know everything.
Yeah.
You can clap, you can snap.
Yeah.
It's okay.
So, Kwaku, maybe we should follow that. Okay,
We had one more, yeah.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think confirmation bias plays a big role in it, because people are looking for information that confirms what they're already thinking. I mean, adults do that, so it makes sense that young people would also. And then when you were discussing, you said, do your research. That used to just sort of mean like, look it up, right? And now there's so many different places and things that you can look up, and young people don't want to do that extra step, nor should they have to, but this is where we are.
Great points. Louie.
Because I really love that comment about, well, who are the sort of players in this game that's actually making this difficult to begin with? And when we sort of first pitched this Den Talk, I mean, the first thing we did is we called each other and said, well, what are we going to talk about? And Kwaku had sent me a book, and in many ways, this is like an unpaid advertisement for
this book.
for this book called The Attention Merchants, which, just to give a little bit of context, is a kind of history of advertisement in a way, specifically people who had become experts at being able to farm our attention. And as the sort of technology evolved, so did the strategies and the techniques that these companies were essentially doing in order to just captivate people at all times. Now, Kwaku, there's a couple sort of case studies illustrated in here. A lot of them are around just getting people to buy stuff.
Right.
But
Not all of them.
But not all of them.
Right.
You want to talk through sort of the ones that you found especially striking, and how that reflects what's going on today?
And scary, I would say. So this book is fantastic. And in general, I personally love to read books that have nothing to do with education and try to connect them to what is happening in the work that I'm doing. And I highly recommend this book. So this book, it starts off at, quickly, talk about the case study. Talk about the case study in the high school.
The opening of this book
Yeah.
actually does explore this very interesting scenario that happened to a school in California who was not doing well and was sort of just in threat of being shut down. And they couldn't sort of secure the right funding that they needed to really support the types of students that they had. And, this sort of shady figure in a suit came and said, look, I can make your financial issues disappear. All you have to do is sort of sell me the rights of your space so that I can just get some paid advertisement in here. And that was a really hard decision for that principal, but in some ways it wasn't, because he's like, I can either, have the Taco Bell sponsored food court
Or the bake sale.
or what, just turn this thing into a freaking NASCAR show, or I could shut my school down. I mean, what decision do you think that school leader made? But there's a reason that guy was willing to pay such a premium to get into that school.
And so, in general, whether we think about it or not, we aren't competing with other schools. We're competing with TikTok. We're competing with Instagram. We're competing with Facebook. We're competing with Netflix, because we all have a limited amount of attention. In a day, in a month, we have so much space in our head for information. And so that real estate becomes increasingly valuable. The thing about this book that really struck me, it talks about, it starts from the first newspaper, moves through radio, television, internet, and it talks about two people specifically, Hitler and Oprah, because they were able to capture attention and imagination. And when, I was telling Louie, you got to read this book. And this isn't something they talk about in this book, but there's a section where they talk about the format that Hitler would use in giving his speeches. You start really mellow. You lament things that are bothering you. You build emotionally. And one of his advisors told him, had gone to Harvard and told him about the fight songs that they would sing during the games. And so and the advice he gave to Hitler is, you need to have something very catchy at the end that people can repeat. And so I'm reading this, and I'm a former music teacher, and I'm like, well, that's the song structure of Hey Jude. That's the song structure of Smells Like Teen Spirit. We are, whether we realize it or not, we are genetically coded to respond a certain way to certain triggers. And that is an example of Hitler doing it, but social media, websites, they're all doing the same thing. And there's a reason we're called users, by the way, of these different sites.
This sort of system is, as illustrated in the book, it's highly sophisticated. It's very well researched, right? Through psychology, through statistics, through sociology. And it is sort of militarized against everybody, but young people specifically.
And monetized.
And monetized, of course. Like, that is the ultimate goal of much of this. But there's some other sort of repercussions to that as well. And again, because the vast majority of folks that are highlighted in the book are folks who are seeking capital gain. But Hitler was very different in that regard, in that he was trying to just create a sort of collective of folks who were willing to go with him on this very just hateful journey. And when we think about our current democracy, as wonderful as it is, one feels very fragile right now. And I think a large part of that is because of how these attention merchants have entered into that sphere, which is that, Kwaku, if I can't get you to vote for me based off of the principles that I have, what can I do to capture your attention so that you're sort of more amenable to listening to what I have to say over long periods of time, and then slowly do you sort of switch to that platform? And that is by and large how politically we see this sort of manufacturing of dissent. This is sort of the disintegration of truth, because it's better if I can capture your attention.
I like how he did that, how he tied that into the title. That was really, I don't mean to embarrass you, but that was great.
This is where it comes from.
Yeah.
And then this is, like you said, we are educators and we have a certain amount of time with our students and we have to hit our curriculum. And now, now we're doing the deeper learning thing, so we know we're trying to integrate those things. And then now this report in 2013 comes out, said that students can't discern real from fake websites. But there's an entire industry that's creating these fake websites for the sole purpose of confusing people. Mm-hmm. That's the sort of landscape.
And the siloing of people as well. So one of the things that Louie and I were talking about when we were preparing the speech, I'm a man of a certain age, meaning I was born in the 70s. And so I went to college in the 90s. And one of the things I talked about with Louie was when I was in college, I had no idea what the political affiliations were of the people that I would go to a party with or the people I was friends with. I had no idea. Someone would say something and I'd be like, well, I don't know if I agree with that, but I still like you, so that's fine. And so this would be interesting for a podcast because it's really visual. By a show of hands, how many of you have scenarios like that now? Social relationships where you do not know the political view of who the people are. Not bad. It's more numbers than I was expecting. So I would follow up. For the purpose of the podcast, it was maybe 8 people that raised their hands out of 35. Mm-hmm. Is that a majority of your relationships? Those of you who raised your hands? The idea of the siloing of our, whether it be our community, our country, our world, that leads to this disintegration of truth. Someone mentioned confirmation bias earlier. That's where that comes from. You hang out with the people that are in the same echo chamber as you. And when I say you, I'm including me in that as well. Mm. You hang out with these people and they say the things and you're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then that tour goes to the Capitol and, a lot of people are yang each other. But we have like 5 more minutes of negative talk, I think.
Is that it?
Yeah, because...
We got a lot to cover.
No, I know, but we're going to have to wrap it up soon.
So let's sort of transition to this other piece I wanted to talk to you about, which was the sort of role of influencers informing the sort of beliefs of people. And I had sort of pulled up, I don't have just the statistic, but when we're looking at sort of how folks feel about gender equality and we look at the demographics across the United States, like there's a nice trend towards people being way more in favor of gender equality, but we're starting to see a shift in that with young men.
Specifically.
And not just the United States. I also just looked it up and found out that this was very prevalent in Korea as well, and other places where it's trending the other way. And the question is, where does it come from? Anybody know who Andrew Tate is? Unfortunately, right? So for those that don't know, this is an influencer who just spews some of the is the sort of embodiment of toxic masculinity and is sort of reveling in that thing. And although I sort of, when I first heard of this, was just very dismissive of it, of like, there's always going to be people who have that voice. I did not understand how big that network was and how many young men were really subscribing to that. Enough to make a global shift in demographics.
And I used to hear people talk about the crisis of men, and I'd say, well, that's horribly sexist. What about all of the, the women that I work with who will talk to me about the issues that they have to face every day? And, in hearing some of the statistics that Louie shared, I realized there is a bit of a crisis of men because of that siloing and that confirmation bias due to an influencer or influencers, because he isn't the only one.
Yeah.
Like that. And once again, that affects everything that each of us do every day as educators, because that creates the lens through which everything you teach is seen through. That's the sieve that all that information goes through. Mm-hmm. Were you raising your hand? Okay, good. I mean, you can if you have questions. Okay, okay, cool. I expect to hear from you. All right.
We have a hand up.
Oh, we do have a hand up.
So I just kind of want to ask this question as a younger teacher. I'm only in my 4th year teaching, and I recently taught I Am Malala to my 7th graders, and that brings up a lot of conversations. I had some kids asking me, things about Pakistan. I had some kids asking me, like, what is ISIS? And then I had some of my male students who are probably influenced by some of the things you were talking about saying, I don't even understand the point of this book. It's stupid. And there's so much going on that it's kind of exhausting for me because I don't really know where to hit the angle. I know that I should be there to educate them and guide them, but I don't have all the answers. Sometimes I don't find out the information until the kid blurts it out in class.
Right.
So it's just, I don't know. I'm just trying to say, like, what would be the best thing that we could do in this information age where everything is getting thrown at us? It's getting thrown at the kids, it's getting thrown at me, and I just don't know what to do with it.
I'm going to be honest. I'm not even 100% sure that I know what to do. I don't think that there is like, and I mean, I really want to hear your thoughts on this too. I don't think there is the answer for that. Oh, when the kid does this, give them this book or call their parent and say this because surprise, the parents are also being influenced by specific things as well. And they have their influencers. I have my influencers. And that's what Louie and I were talking about, the whole concept of social media, the idea of everyone being the protagonist in their own story. And then we also have these other protagonists that we just follow. You know, they're the people that you don't know that you follow on social media because they're interesting, because it's their little version of reality TV. We're gonna touch on that. I love that you asked that question. We're gonna touch on that.
And I want to I had a conversation with a sociologist, and we were sort of talking about, again, this rise of disinformation. And she said that her research was exploring the relationship between folks having an excess of information, which, you know, the millennials started to have, and then Gen Z has access to every problem the world has ever had.
Gen X, we were clueless. We knew nothing.
Showing my age a bit here too. But she said that folks tend to have one of two sort of intensely different responses. One is that when people have too much access to information, some folks are sort of made excited by that. They become eager then to absorb as much as possible. This is like the folks who will just go on the Wikipedia spiral, right? And there's another group of folks who do the opposite. It is very threatening to them, and they have a visceral reaction that wants them to shrink the scope of what they're hearing and learning. And so in a lot of these instances, what I think happens is we often treat the solution to, oh, this type of ignorance is give them more information. Do more research.
The research.
The research.
Do the research.
And then you'll sort of find your way. But it's not effective for two ways. One, it's not effective because that's even going to lock them up more and sort of have them dig their heels in that sort of narrow perspective that they have.
Yep.
And two, this is a big point. We were talking about flat earthers.
Mm-hmm. Well, Louie asked, why are we doing this talk? And I was like, because I don't live on a flat earth. And I just want to put that out there. Other people may, but I don't.
Yeah. And if you've ever sort of heard any of the discourse of flat earth, like, they approach it very logically. Their logic is incorrect, but it's not bad. Their science is good, but it's wrong. They're pulling the same information that a lot of us are and coming to very different conclusions. And in many instances, when they do the research, they're doing it to affirm, not challenge, what they believe. Which I think we sort of found through talking that this in many ways is the root of the issue. This inability to actually challenge what we think and know as potentially being wrong.
And that ties to the question you're asking. What are you telling them? What are you giving them to think about? And the more you give them, the more either they're open to a bunch of ideas or they're digging in. Nope, but that's not what I was listening to Andrew Tate. They may not say it out loud, but he says this, so that doesn't align with that. And so repeat that last thing you said about the idea of being wrong. You don't remember, do you?
I do.
Okay.
I'm trying to sort of contextualize a little differently. And sort of to make it personal, because as sort of wise as I hope I am, Like I do the same thing
Me too.
where I'm very, very convinced about the things that I believe and the things that I do. And I'm well aware of the fact that I'm probably wrong a lot. But when's the last time I've ever, I mean, let me ask this to y'all. Like, when's the last time you legitimately accepted that you were wrong about something?
And how did you put it out into the world? And I have an example. I have a really embarrassing example that I can give while you guys think about it, because I'll be honest, probably no one wants to share that in this room, but I will. So specifically within a school, there was a class, I pushed into this class, it was an art class, and there was a student in this class who was a bit of a bully and would say a lot of negative things about the work that other students created. But the point of the class was a critique where you're getting feedback. And so when it was his turn, he lashed out when he received any negative feedback. And so sometimes the teacher will call me, be like, hey, come to this class and course correct a little bit, make some jokes, but also, help me, I'm an authentic audience, help to redirect the kids because they're hearing her voice all the time. And with this student, I went too far. I didn't curse at him. I didn't, yell at him, but I definitely know that there's a line between creating boundaries and, embarrassing a child. And I crossed that line. But I was affirmed by some of the other students in the class and the teacher. Fast forward a month later, we go on a field trip. The kid does not want to go on the field trip because he knows that I'm going on the field trip. And I'm talking to the teacher and I'm like, I don't know, maybe I went too far. She's like, no, he's that kid in class. But she's dealing with him all the time. So I see him on campus afterwards, and I'm like, hey, come here. And he's like, yeah. And I was like, I need to apologize to you. I was unfair to you in that scenario. You weren't really well behaved towards your classmates, but as the teacher, I shouldn't have done that to you. And that kid was shocked. And he's like, oh, well, you're right. I was that way. As we get older, once again, Gen X, it becomes harder to admit you are wrong. It's very safe to be within you can justify your choices and you have enough power in a lot of scenarios to just be wrong and justify it. I had to be wrong to this. And that kid reminds me of the kids that you're talking about. And he was shocked that I would say I'm wrong and I would admit it to him and I would apologize to him because I don't have to. So, to reframe Louie's question, as educators, how do you admit when you're wrong? How do you frame that for your students? Because we have a working theory that this is part of it. Part of, we're going to come to you. Oh, because you have one. Great. All right. Can I? I don't care. But as we pass the mic, part of our theory, and we'll expand upon it more, is the idea of being discerning and the idea of not being locked into a perspective is admitting that you can be wrong in your personal life, your professional life, whatever. As educators, how are we doing that? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, super loud. I'll say
We can hear you now.
yes, clearly. I'll say, I can't think of a single particular one because there's so many. And really what this talk brings to mind is like, why is it that way? And that's something that for me in my practice, I've always wondered. I've had veteran teachers when I was a younger teacher be like, you can't let students know that you make mistakes or boop, boop, boop. Mm-hmm. But that's never been me. For me, I've always been willing to admit when I'm wrong. It's not a big deal. And as I was thinking about it, I think so much of it has to do with this sense of morality tied to rightness. Like, if we're right, then we're more likely to be good people. But if we're wrong, what does that say about us, right? And now I'm a teacher and I'm wrong and I've led the students astray. So I think in my perspective, from what I've seen, a lot of it has to do with like these values that we have about who we are as people. And it can be really hard for people to divorce this idea of who I am with the fact that like we're humans and we're limited, and it's it's like when we have the option of leaning into curiosity versus leaning into this sense that I'm a great person who knows everything, where it feels better, like you're saying, it feels better to lean into the other one, because curiosity is a sticky thing. It can bring things to our lives that feel uncomfortable, and we're not always willing to do the work.
I love that. Yep, this gentleman with the hat over here. I believe your name is Tony. Yeah, no, there's only one microphone. It's,
One mic. Nas.
there
Anyway,
we go.
so I want to share a quick story related to this point, and then kind of tell you how I processed it. So prior to 2016, I think it was 2015, I had a young man, and my school, we deal with a lot of the young men who system involved, gang affiliated, whatever. And this young man got into some trouble in the school, and he was brought to my office. So I do this normal thing. I talk, the mentor thing. Hey, you could be better than that, blah, 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 blah. And he was barely listening to me. And I was, just trying to get to him. Then finally he said, yo, man, it just doesn't matter. And I was like, well, what do you mean it doesn't matter? He said, it just doesn't matter. Nothing matters. I said, you can't just say that. He says, look, man, Trump is about to be the president. Nothing matters anymore. And then I said to him, I can guarantee you one thing. Trump will never be the president.
Didn't you see that Simpsons episode? Anyway, go on.
And I didn't. And he was like, yeah, you don't know what you're talking. I said, look, I started going on all the things that I read, all the things I knew about politics. I was a poli-sci major. I was just going on all the logical reasons why this dude was never going to be president.
Yeah.
He became president, y'all, right? I never got the chance to apologize to that young man because somehow we lost him in the system, and unfortunately that happens. But I had to apologize nevertheless. And one of the things that I learned from that is we really, really need to listen to our young people, particularly now. They may not have the same kind of adherence to the things we read, the way we apply logic, but they have a sense of things. And some of those could be abhorrent to us and make us feel a certain way. But my main point is that, irrespective of how you think about that, it is so important for us on this intergenerational level to recognize how important it is for us to get into that space with them, to believe what you're hearing and seeing with them. Don't put yourself so high above them, and allow yourself to be vulnerable, allow yourself to be to open-minded to hear them, so that you could begin to build trust and you can understand where they are. There was this research a while back talking about a tribe apart, and this was really before all of social media, and looking at how young people were basically raising themselves and being in these conversations amongst themselves and knowing how to tolerate us and talk to us, but nevertheless they had this whole other community. That's on a hyper level now, right? So the thing that I recognize and the things that we try to do is enter into that space with them by building trust, allowing them to speak their truths. And through that trust, being able to have conversations that aren't always just about, what we know and they don't know, but about, really having those, each side breaking down a little bit and being open to each other. I think that's just our best chance.
I love that.
Let's clap for that first. And I just want to say, maybe this is the thing that gets me in trouble.
Oh,
I knew
are
that
we
we
at that
won.
part of
Yeah.
the show? Is it? It might be too early. I don't think that clock's working, by the way.
Yeah.
5:12, almost 5:12.
Okay.
Okay,
nice.
all right.
Which is that there, of course, there's a political dimension to all of this, but Kwaku, you had asked me earlier, like, well, how does this sort of show up in the context of you teaching at the college level, and I was thinking about the sort of polarization and how sort of information is exchanged and how we sort of get to actually talk about real stuff. And I've had a lot of situations where I have my own political beliefs and I get triggered a lot,
Really?
for those that know. And so this thing happens when somebody says something kind of bigoted, where the conversation never starts with that. The conversation ends with that piece. Because whatever conversation we were happening, what happens is my people are like, you've created an unsafe space for me, and we're not going to have this conversation. You need to get yourself right. And that's sort of how we treat those conversations, which is different from like, just listen to them say this really toxic stuff. I'm trying really hard not to swear.
You're doing a great job.
Which is, it's painful, right?
Yeah.
Because, now we're left with this gross feeling, and we have our other students who are probably already marginalized, who are now experiencing more trauma because of this, and the attention is sort of here. And at the same time, like, this is the moment to have that conversation. And as awful as it is, and as re-traumatizing as it may be, the worst thing is probably just to be like, this conversation's done.
Yeah.
But how often do we do that? You've created an unsafe space. Go get yourself right. Go do your research. Here's more information. Out with you. As opposed to being like, let's talk about this thing that many people have many feelings about. And that's another thing that I have to admit, because I do that all the time too.
Because you're human.
Yeah.
And you have an emotional response to something that either is offensive or sometimes basically is insane. That makes a ton of sense. Full circle back to the Stanford students that were in that study. When Louie was sharing that fact with me, I was like, oh wait a minute, this makes sense. In the way that if you're going to a school like that, it's very rare that you're wrong. You don't get questions wrong on tests. Your test scores, your SATs are amazing. You're never challenged on what you're thinking. Mm-hmm. So whatever your first instinct is, that needs to be right. Which is very toxic. It's part of the reason, shameless plug, that my kids are part of this school system, because I want them to be wrong. And we were talking about this. When in school, you have this definitive thing. How did I do? How was my score on that thing? How was my essay? I made the least amount of mistakes. I'm great at this. How many of you, coming out of whatever teacher training you were in, went directly in the classroom and you did great in grad school and you went to the classroom and you were a fantastic teacher right away? Show of hands again, just for the podcast. All of you. Those of you who are listening, you went to the wrong school. None of us. We all went into that room and we're like, whoa, this is not like the class that I took. This was never in the book. Why is that kid, I taught elementary school. Why is that kid in the corner and what's he doing with his nose? Like, that is never in the book. Why is this kid yelling at me or just yelling out? You have to fail repeatedly to just be okay. And there's this process, whether you're a teacher, you're a scientist, you're a writer, you're going through a series of failures. To get to the point to be okay, to get to the point where you're like, oh, I kind of know how to do this. Coming back to your question. The more we do that, the more we fail, the more that we can demonstrate how to do that gracefully and be okay with it. The more that we can be okay with people questioning us and being like, oh, you know what? I think you're wrong. For the longest time, I thought JFK was in Long Island. Apparently, it's in Queens. But I had several arguments about this. I was like, no, it's right there. The more we can do that, the less susceptible we are to these algorithms that are targeting us. The less susceptible we are to not ending the conversation, like Louie said. Tell me more. Why do you feel that way? Great. Show me an example.
I want to step back a little bit and just sort of look at where we've come, because
Please.
it is a big jump from when you read the title. We're talking about the disintegration of truth, how that's sort of fueled by AI, emerging tech, all of the above, and then where we're sort of landing, which is like it's actually about our inability to be wrong. It's a big jump. But it's pretty clear that the answer to disinformation, like I do think that we can fortify the idea of truth holding value again. I think that has been diminished. We need to work to strengthen that, yes. And also, because of, I think it was you that made the comment, there is something important about the subjective experience. And for a long time, that was really discounted. And we're sort of now in an age when the subjective has truth. There's power there, and it's important. And that's a good thing. It also has strayed us into this like opinion sort of replacing news, and some news channels not even being allowed to call themselves news channels because they are opinion channels. We've really sort of corrected onto that side. And the answer isn't a piece of curriculum. It's something a little deeper, but it's also not just the young people who are experiencing it. It's our own ability to sort of admit those things. And Kwaku and I were joking that we were going to have a demonstration where we pulled in our the sort of printout on the front of the room and just marked out the title and said, just learning how to be wrong. Which is a lot harder
I'm
than
still working on it. I'm still working on it. You're wrong about that, Luke. No, I'm kidding.
We might be.
I think we should, we only have 10 minutes
Yeah,
left.
so let's-
Can we do just straight questions?
Straight questions.
Where did you get that shirt from? No, those aren't the questions. Thoughts, questions, yeah.
So I think in my perspective, I get locked into the idea that students have that instant gratification piece now, that they need the answer, need the thing right now, because everything's right at their fingertips. So how do we start shifting that mindset to also allow everything else we've talked about with okay being wrong and doing more research and bringing those pieces back?
That's a good question. And then I want to qualify this by saying in no way is Louie or I. We are not experts in this. So all this is opinion based, which is ironic based upon everything we've talked about. Right?
Yeah.
That's full circle.
Yeah.
But I think there's a difference between what is the answer and why do you think this is the answer? It's not great. This is the answer. You found it. Why do you think this is true? There might be a level of it in having that conversation with them where they're like, well, wait a minute. Well, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who has different political views than I do. And I was like, all right, well, this is great. You know, I haven't heard of this. Can you give me an example? Can you give me research? And so he calls me back a couple weeks later and he's like, oh, well, you know, I saw this and I saw this on Hannity. And I'm like, all right, well, that's cool that you saw it on Hannity. If I brought you the opposite opinion from Rachel Maddow, what would your thoughts be? And he's like, oh, okay, I'm going to find another source. Asking why. Because at work, no one cares let me reframe that. In some jobs, it is yes or no. But it is easier to build consensus if you can get people on board with why you think something should be done, not this is what should be done. And this is coming from someone who fails at doing that regularly. Louie, what do you think?
Yes, agree.
Cool. That's it?
I have a question about a particular dilemma at the moment where there are multiple truths going on. There's some different disinformation, yes, but it's not disinformation versus truth over here. Israel and Gaza.
Wow.
I know that my son has lost friends over this, and I know it's been very difficult for a lot of people. I just wonder what your thinking is about it, and as it brings its way into our schools,
Yeah.
how do we conduct conversations about that, and without simply walking away from it?
Yeah.
You want to start?
Yes,
give you the
this is
easy
a
one.
very tough one to talk about, but let me just lay this out, which is the Gaza thing was interesting to me because when George Floyd was murdered, that was a sort of easy conversation to have because folks who believed one thing really believed one thing, and those who believed the other really believed the other. And then, even though those conversations were awful, there was sort of a clear right answer, it felt like, for a lot of people.
Right.
You know? And this was the first situation where it was very clear there was no clear right answer, that it was really ambiguous. And I remember the feeling of when all of that was going down, how quiet it was at Stanford about it. Like none of the staff at the D school talked about it, even though like you might have had a friend that was personally affected, but like nobody wanted to open up that Pandora's box because I think folks were scared that this was going to be the first time that we were going to apply the sort of same approach that we apply to the other, which is like, I'm shutting your shit down.
There it is. You got so close.
Sorry, Randy. Sorry. Okay.
You're sugar down. Go on.
What we typically do is, we hear the other perspective and we're just like, no, we're not having it. And I think there was a fear of we're going to start doing that with our own friends. And we became scared of the monster that in many ways we created.
Yeah.
And therefore, we were just going to remain real silent about it.
See, so it's interesting because my experience was, I work at a Jewish day school. So that experience is very different. And full disclosure, last May for work, I traveled to Israel. And the area that I traveled to was one of the areas that was attacked. And so I know 2 or 3 people who were killed. Shar HaNegev? Yeah. With Gary?
I've been in Sderot
Oh, wow.
with Gary.
Okay.
But I've also lived in 2 years in Morocco.
Okay.
So
right.
it's just,
And so personally, I felt mixed in a lot of ways. One, I felt, because I work with a lot of Israelis, I don't have the space to be upset about this because this is where other people are from. And I was like, is this how people felt during George Floyd? 2, I literally, people that I knew and I met and that I liked are gone for no reason whatsoever. And that's not fair. And there's anger. And 3, there is any city you've ever been to, there is always going to be a part of the city where you're like, man, if I could live in this city, I would live here. And then you might drive through another area, usually on the way to the airport. Boy, am I glad I don't live in this part of this city. And there is a really distinct disparity in that region between areas in that way. So that was what I was thinking about. And I won't go into too much detail, but the sentiment where I worked was a little more focused on the anger portion of it than let's say that I felt. And I did feel some anger and a lot of sadness. And I actually actively repressed that every day. And then you combine that with social media, with relatives and friends who've never been there and have dissertations and images and videos and things pointing in certain ways. And I can relate to that because I had that same opinion and fear before I went there. And I went there and I was like, oh, well, this isn't what I see on social media. Imagine that. Social media is not accurate. I think that you ask a great question, which there isn't a definitive answer to, which is symbolic of the entire region. In the way that in ways both groups are correct. No one ever blames England. I don't think England listens to this podcast, so hopefully, okay, there's one person. But, no one ever blames England. If that makes sense to you, if it doesn't, in the way that they promised to land to both groups of people. And then oil came into the mix and like, whoa, wait a minute, we're just going to disappear. I think that is a really interesting example of the complexity of life. And a really simplified version of this is when a couple decides to divorce. In the way that they both see what is happening in their relationship from their perspective, and they're justified in the way that they see it. And there's anger, and there's hurt, and there's disappointment, and there's poor decisions made based upon emotion. But at the same time, they're both wrong for acting out in that way. There is no definitive right, which is what you're saying in that scenario. That is not necessarily the opinion of other people that I work with, and I understand that. But I think specifically in schools, it is important for kids to see that life is not binary. Yeah. That you're not always going to have this scenario where it's like, oh, he's wrong or she's wrong because of this, so I need to side with that. And the idea of really focusing on the empathy on both sides. Because there's been a lot of loss for a lot of people, and I'm not going to do the thing where you're like, whoa, this many people had this and this many people had that. It doesn't matter. You lose someone from your family, you're not keeping track of how many other people lost on the other side, because you're focused on your pain and what you won't ever have again. This is our last question.
Yeah. I find it really interesting and perhaps not surprising that in this conversation around truth, right, we really are focused in on like our humanity, what sort of like distinguishes us and sort of like our emotions and like listening to one another and having empathy, because it stands in such, stark contrast to, the large language models, generative AI that is becoming sort of more and more, I think, a feature in the sort of production of this sort of like post-truth world that we're entering. And I just find it like really interesting to reflect on how not so long ago, like a decade ago, I was a history teacher, and we would, talk to students about primary sources, and primary sources sort of being artifacts that sort of like allow you to understand truth of what actually happened. And now we're in a world where like you could just create primary sources and effectively like create artifacts that, are believable, that, actually like speak to, whatever people want to produce. And I guess like I'm just curious, because we haven't explicitly like spoken about sort of like where we're rapidly heading, where essentially, you can literally at the push of a button create any truth you want or representation of truth that you want. And sort of like, how do we sort of like work with young people to maybe see some like, hey, maybe there are some opportunities in this, but also like some like profound dystopian elements of it. One thing I'll just share really quickly, I found it so interesting. I had a conversation with some folks who are building like a AI tool, in the deeper learning kind of niche. And they were like, basically the tool was, hey, we can, basically like make a project idea for teachers, which I think is interesting. But then we were like, okay, but what really, a project idea that was like unique to students' individual interest. So like, hey, I'm interested in this, a project for that. But it's like, what actually makes an idea engaging? And one of the things we started riffing on was like, well, big props to Rob here of like authentic audience, right? It matters that like our work, resonates in a real way for a real purpose. And, we started riffing on like, well, very quickly, we'll like have bots that can effectively like pretend to be, an authentic audience for young people. Like, and is that good? Is that an opportunity? Or is it like dystopian and deeply problematic? So that was a lot I just shared. I don't know if it's a question, but...
Yeah, what was the question again? No, I mean, there was a lot of info there, but specifically...
Yeah. No, I think it's just like, what are the implications particularly around like generative AI and large language models in this conversation? I think it's... And where we're headed, exactly.
I like to give you the easy one, Louie. Do you want to start with this?
Yeah, well, so the first thing that I think is really interesting is when I hear critiques of generative AI right now, it's that they present false information with a lot of authority. And I'm like, oh, these machines really are learning from us.
It's like, who else does that?
And that as a prospect is troublesome at most, right? It also reminded me of something that I had shared with Kwaku around how do you sort of support students in navigating some of these spaces. And I have a friend, she is an educator. She's an incredible, incredible mother, and she can do something that I don't know a lot of parents could sort of be able to do. I don't know how she pulls that off, but here's what she does. At the end of the week, she takes her high school daughter, they sit down, and they go through all her social media together. Which, when I first heard it, I was like, oh my God, that sounds so exhausting and also like invasive, right? Yeah. It's like, whoa. But, you know, she has created the sort of rapport and the sort of trust and the vulnerability. And it's not about saying like, I can't believe you said this on Instagram, more of like, here's some of the things that were posted. Here's some comments that folks made about this picture that you posted. What does that mean to you? And really helping her sort of navigate that tricky thing. I think there's probably a world in which we cannot just give this technology to students and be like, figure it out, but also if I catch you using too much of it on a report, I'll fail you. There has to be something in between that's like, let's sit together and see what it can do. Let's really look at what it can't do. And then let's make sense of what we want to do with that. It's not, I don't think that sort of informs what the distant future will look like, but the tech is coming. The tech is coming.
Dun, dun, dun.
It doesn't stop. What can shift is our ability to navigate that tech in ways that matter. Because how folks are using it now is as replacements for them needing to put themselves on the line to be wrong, to not have the answer, to sort of try and actually do research that might challenge their beliefs, right? It's just like, let me just manufacture this thing that I kind of have a superficial idea of and make it sound like it has authority. That's not problem with the technology. That's problem with what we're inputting into it, what we're desiring from it. So I think that's probably the first place that we need to work on, the first thing we need to work on.
I'm just going to co-sign that. I mean, it's in us, and what we put in is what we get out. Similar to what we do in our classrooms and any relationship that we have, and not being drawn into the binary. That's all I have to say about that.
Louie, I think what you just said is beautiful because it says something about how we need to rethink teaching and learning.
Yes.
Your example was an example of a dialogical approach to understanding the world, the world, both the real world and the media world. But it's a dialogical approach to understanding, which runs counter to the approach that we have in conventional classrooms across the world, across the nation, which is a hierarchical approach to versions of truth, and so on. So dialogue and dialogical approaches are what I think, or what you were implying, is needed to cope with the world that's emerging here.
Oh, are we? We're kind of done. They're kicking us out of this room.
There's a line outside.
There's a line of people. Thank you guys so much for coming and listening and contributing. You could have been downstairs, and you chose to be here. Yeah. And Louie and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I thought this was going to be the overflow room.
We really thought it was.
No, they are here for you. Let's hear it one more time for them. Really nice and loud. Complicated stuff. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of Deeper Learning.